Imagine losing everything in a single battle, then somehow turning it all around to win the war. Sounds impossible, right? Well, that's exactly what Julius Caesar pulled off after one of the most devastating defeats of his career. Picture this. His army's been smashed, his men are starving, his reputation's in tatters, and his former ally turned bitter enemy is hunting him down with twice as many soldiers. Most generals would have surrendered or fled back to Italy with their tail between their legs. But Caesar, he did something absolutely mental. He marched deeper into enemy territory and set up one of the most brilliant military traps in ancient history. What happens next at a place called Pharsalus will decide the fate of the entire Roman Republic. If this story grabs you, stick around because we're about to dive into one of history's most incredible comebacks. So, let's rewind a bit. Caesar had just taken an absolute battering at a place called Dyrrhachium. I mean, properly hammered. Pompey's forces had broken through his siege lines, scattered his troops, and left him looking like a complete mug in front of the entire Roman world. Once those fortifications fell, there was no point hanging about. Caesar gathered what was left of his battered legions, pulled everyone back to a safe position, and had to face the grim reality of his situation. His options, not brilliant, to be honest. He couldn't just stay put, could he? His soldiers were absolutely knackered, physically exhausted, and mentally shattered. You've got to understand, these were hardened veterans who'd conquered Gaul alongside Caesar, and even they were rattled. On top of that, supplies were running dangerously low, and he had loads of wounded men who desperately needed proper medical attention. So what could he actually do? One option was to march his army overland all the way back to Italy. There he could rebuild, recruit fresh troops, lick his wounds, and come back stronger. But that route was a nightmare long, treacherous terrain, barely any food or water for an entire army on the move. Plus, and this was crucial, it would mean abandoning all his legions stationed throughout the eastern provinces. They'd be left completely exposed to Pompey's revenge. Not exactly the actions of a loyal commander. Could he sail back to Italy instead? Not a chance. Caesar had no fleet worth mentioning, and Pompey's ships absolutely dominated the Mediterranean. The sea routes were locked down tighter than a Roman garrison. That left him with just one realistic option, and it was the most audacious one of all. March deeper into Greece, link up with his scattered forces, rebuild his strength in hostile territory. Absolutely bonkers when you think about it. But that's exactly what he did. After giving his exhausted men a brief Caesar led them into the fertile plains of Thessaly. Meanwhile, Pompey had his own decision to make. His advisors were practically screaming at him to sail to Italy, to take Rome itself, while Caesar was weak. Some wanted him to march their overland through Illyria. Made sense, really. Control Rome, control the Republic. But Pompey wasn't having it. He was riding high after his victory at Dyrrhachium. His army's morale was through the roof, and he was convinced he could finish Caesar off once and for all. So, instead of going for Rome, he went for the kill. He set off after Caesar's battered army. Now, Caesar made it to Apollonia, where he restocked his supplies, food, weapons, medical gear, everything his army desperately needed. He left his sick and wounded there to recover properly, because dragging them along would have slowed everyone down. Then he did something clever. He sent all the heavy baggage ahead with orders to march quickly. This meant his legionaries could travel light and fast, covering far more ground than Pompey's army, which was still weighed down by all its equipment and supplies. Classic Caesar, always thinking tactically. Pompey quickly realized he wasn't going to catch Caesar's main force in time, so he sent his cavalry racing ahead to cut them off. They caught up with Caesar's rear guard near a bridge crossing the river Gene. The Pompeian horsemen tried to force a fight right there, tried to block the crossing and trap Caesar's forces on the wrong side of the river. But they hadn't counted on Caesar's Gallic cavalry absolute warriors. These lads, they smashed into Pompey's cavalry, drove them back into disarray, and cleared the bridge. Caesar's army crossed safely and kept marching. Caesar's destination was a meet with Domitius, one of his loyal commanders who'd been holding down a separate front. He marched his army through Epirus and Athemania, taking routes that would get him there fastest. Pompey, meanwhile, was also heading for Macedonia but took a completely different route through Condavia. Both armies were racing across Greece, and the tension must have been absolutely unbearable. Here's the thing, Domitius had been locked in a standoff with Scipio's army for ages. There'd been skirmishes, Losses on both sides, but neither commander dared risk a proper full-scale battle. Both Caesar and Pompey were sending messengers flying in every direction, trying to coordinate their forces. Pompey's couriers spread word of Caesar's defeat everywhere they went. And you can imagine the effect that had. Towns that had been on the fence quickly declared for Pompey. They refused to give Caesar's troops food or supplies. Messages between Caesar and Domitius kept getting intercepted or lost in all the chaos. Only the most critical order, the one telling Domitius to break camp and march to join Caesar actually, got through. But here's where it gets mental. Domitius didn't know which route Caesar would take or where exactly they were supposed to meet, so he made his best guess, broke camp, and set off at a forced march along the shortest route to Via Egnatia toward Dyrrhachium and Apollonia. And coming straight down that very same road, heading directly toward him, was Pompey's entire army. I mean, what are the odds? They missed each other by literally 4 hours. 4 hours. Domitius' scouts spotted Pompey's advance guard just in time. He wheeled his entire army around and managed to join up with Caesar near a town called Aeginium, right on the Thessalian border. Talk about a close call. Their combined forces then marched on the town of Gumphi. Now, Gumphi had been loyal to Caesar originally, but after hearing about his defeat at Dyrrhachium, they'd switched sides and slammed their gates shut. Caesar wasn't in the mood for negotiations. He ordered an assault, and within just a few hours his legions had stormed the walls and taken the city. He let his men sack it partly for supplies, partly to send a message to other cities thinking about switching sides. From Gumphi, Caesar moved on to Metropolis, which, having seen what happened to Gumphi, wisely opened its gates without a fight. Meanwhile, After Domitius left to join Caesar, Scipio pulled his troops back to Larissa, where Pompey soon arrived. Their armies merged into a single massive force, and before long, these two former allies, these two giants of Rome, drew close to each other and made camp near a place called Pharsalus. Pompey positioned his army on high ground at the foot of the mountains. Caesar set up camp in the valley below. The stage was set for the showdown everyone knew was coming. The senators and aristocrats in Pompey's camp were absolutely gagging for a decisive battle. They wanted Caesar's head, wanted this whole civil war finished. But Pompey, showing his experience, chose to wait. He knew Caesar's supplies were critically low. Every single day, Caesar would shift his camp closer to Pompey's position, would march his legions out and form them up for battle, desperately trying to provoke a fight. Pompey would do the same, would position his troops on the hillside right beside his camp where the high ground gave him a massive tactical advantage. But he held back, refusing to give Caesar the battle he needed, despite the growing pressure from his impatient allies. According to Caesar's own writings, Pompey had about 55,000 men, though modern historians reckon it was closer to 40,000. Caesar's army numbered roughly 30,000. But here's the kicker: Pompey had a huge advantage in cavalry. 7,000 horsemen to Caesar's mere 1,000. That's a 7-to-1 advantage. Absolutely massive. However, Caesar's legions were far more experienced. These were the veterans who'd conquered Gaul, who'd fought in dozens of brutal campaigns. Their morale was higher too. Despite the recent defeat, they believed in Caesar, trusted him completely. Eventually, Caesar realized Pompey wasn't going to bite. He started breaking camp, preparing to lead his troops off to find better supplies. And that's when Pompey finally decided to fight. Seeing Caesar apparently retreating, Pompey marched his army out and drew them up on the slope, almost at the base of the hill. He was confident that Caesar's men would exhaust themselves climbing uphill and be easier to defeat. Clever thinking. Really. Pompey anchored his right wing on the river Enipius, while his left stretched out onto the plain. Standard Roman formation, heavy infantry in 3 lines. He covered his left flank with light infantry and archers. And here's the key. Biddy massed all 7,000 of his cavalry there. Under Titus Labienus, his commanders were set: Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus on the right wing, Scipio. Holding the center, Lentulus. On the left, Pompey himself stood on the left flank, right beside all that cavalry. His battle plan was straightforward but brutal. Let the infantry hold the line defensively, and at the right moment, send the entire cavalry force smashing into Caesar's right flank. The goal was to break their formation, swing round into their unprotected rear, and finish them off with a combined assault from front and back. On paper, it was brilliant. Caesar deployed his army in 3 lines as well. His left flank rested on rough ground near the river Enipius, while his right stretched across the open plain. On the left stood the 8th and 9th legions, both so depleted from earlier battles that together they barely made up one full-strength legion. On the right stood Caesar's most loyal troops, the legendary 10th Legion, the absolute cream of his army. The 11th and 12th held the center. His commanders were Antony on the left, Domitius in the center, and Sulla on the right. Caesar positioned himself directly opposite Pompey. To match Pompey's line in width and prevent his flanks from being outflanked, Caesar had to thin out his formation. His ranks were only 6 men deep, compared to Pompey's 10. When he saw that Pompey had massed all his cavalry on one flank, Caesar immediately recognized the danger. This is where his military genius really shows. He pulled together a reserve force of 3,000 men, taking cohorts from various legions, gave them very specific orders, and stationed them behind the main line on the right. He also placed a small cavalry force there. The battle kicked off with Caesar's troops advancing. His first and second lines moved forward together, closing the distance. Normally in a Roman battle and remember, both sides were Roman. You'd wait until the enemy was close, then suddenly charge in a rush. Caesar's legionaries expected exactly that. They climbed the slope at a fast march with shields raised, then broke into a run and charged at just the right moment. But Pompey's troops didn't rush forward to meet them. They held their ground, following Pompey's orders. Realizing they'd wear themselves out running uphill straight into a stationary enemy line, Caesar's veterans stopped halfway up the slope. Think about the discipline that takes. They caught their breath, regrouped, and then charged again. They hurled their pelidos, deadly Roman javelins, drew their swords, and struck Pompey's line as one unified force. The Pompeians held firm, took the impact, answered with their own volley of javelins, and then it turned into brutal hand-to-hand combat. The fighting raged along the entire front line, and slowly, after Pompey's cavalry had fled, he'd left the battlefield and returned to his tent. When the fighting reached its peak and the Pompeians broke completely, Caesar's legionaries stormed the camp in pursuit. Realizing the battle was hopelessly lost, Pompey escaped through the rear gate with only a handful of his closest companions. Nightfall was the only thing that saved the fleeing Pompeians from complete annihilation. Those who escaped to the nearby hills tried desperately to make their way to Larissa, but Caesar's troops, moving under cover of darkness, outflanked them and blocked every single road. The remnants of Pompey's army surrendered in droves. Ancient sources report anywhere between 6,000 and 15,000 Pompeians killed, with more than 20,000 captured. Caesar's own losses were heavy to 4,000 of his soldiers died in the fighting. Only a handful of Pompey's men managed to escape death or capture. Nearly all the aristocrats who surrendered were pardoned and released by Caesar. This included Marcus Junius Brutus, who would one day ironically and tragically be among those who assassinated him. Of Pompey's commanders, only Lucius Domitius Aegina Barbus was killed during the pursuit. The rank-and-file soldiers were also pardoned. Many chose to join Caesar's army. The rest were sent home. Classic Caesar, showing mercy to build loyalty. After fleeing the battlefield, Pompey went to Larissa. His remaining companions urged him to sail for Utica, where most of his supporters had gathered, or perhaps to Asia to seek aid from the Parthians. But Pompey chose Egypt, where he'd once forged an alliance with the king and expected a warm welcome. From Larissa, he hurried to the coast, boarded a merchant ship, and sailed via Amphipolis, Mytilene, Italia, and finally to Paphos on Cyprus. From there he sent word to the Egyptian king, asking for permission to land in Alexandria. Caesar, absolutely determined not to give Pompey any chance to regroup and restart the war, set off in pursuit. Meanwhile, fighting continued across the Roman Republic as the two factions clashed in various theaters. The Pompeian commander Libo had seized an island opposite the harbor of Brundisium, from where he kept Caesar's fleet blockaded. Neither minor naval defeats nor supply shortages forced him to abandon this blockade. He only left after hearing news of Pompey's crushing defeat at Pharsalus. Around this time, Pompey's admiral Cassius arrived in Sicily with a fleet. Caesar's ships in the region were stationed in two harbors, one at Messana, the other at Cassius struck Messana first, catching the Caesarians completely off guard. They hadn't expected an attack, and had posted no proper naval patrols. Cassius attacked the fleet as it lay at anchor, using fire ships to destroy it entirely before sailing on to Vibo. There too, he surprised Caesar's forces and managed to burn part of the fleet, though this time he met stiffer resistance and was forced to retreat. Meanwhile, Pompey received word from the Egyptian king, granting him permission to land at Alexandria. In truth, however, Ptolemy had decided to remove an unwelcome problem and secretly plotted Pompey's death. He sent his guard commander Achillas and a military tribune named Septimius, an old acquaintance of Pompey's, to meet him. Pompey, suspecting no danger from a supposed ally, boarded the small boat meant to bring him ashore. That's where Achillas and Septimius murdered him. The great Pompey Magnus, who'd conquered the East, who'd been Rome's most powerful man, was stabbed to death in a rowboat off the coast of Egypt. A tragic, inglorious end to an extraordinary life. And there you have it. The Battle of Pharsalus, one of history's most brilliant military victories, pulled off by a man who just weeks earlier had been on the run with a defeated army. Caesar turned his greatest defeat into his greatest triumph through tactical genius, understanding of his enemy, and absolute trust in his veteran legions. This battle didn't just decide the Civil War, it's changed the entire course of Roman history and, by extension, Western civilization itself. If you've stuck with this story all the way to the end, we absolutely appreciate it. This is the kind of history that reminds us why studying the past matters. These were unjust names in a textbook. They were real people, making life or death decisions that shaped our world. If you enjoyed diving into this ancient battle, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most incredible moments. We're putting out new content regularly, covering everything from ancient civilizations to pivotal battles that changed the world. Drop a comment below telling us what historical event you'd like us to cover next. And if you really want to support what we're doing here, consider leaving a super. Thanks every bit helps us keep bringing you these stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep exploring history.